The tone around Raiders camp changed on day 13, and the timing is what makes it so interesting. Kirk Cousins was dominating the red zone, Brock Bowers was back on the field, Fernando Mendoza continued building chemistry with Malik Benson, and young defenders were making their own case. On paper, it looked like another productive day in Las Vegas. But I don't think day 13 should be judged by the numbers alone, because this was the final practice before the Raiders leave the comfort of their own building and head to Houston for joint practices with the Texans. And that changes everything. For nearly 2 weeks, Las Vegas has been competing against players it already knows. The quarterbacks know the defensive tendencies. The receivers know how certain defensive backs react. The offensive line knows the pressure packages. Coaches can control the contact and protect players when necessary. Houston won't offer that comfort. The Texans are bringing a completely different defense, different pressure looks, different matchups, and one of the nastiest pass rush combinations the Raiders are going to see all summer. That's why I'm treating day 13 as a preview rather than a conclusion. There were plenty of reasons to be encouraged, starting with Cousins. His red zone period was one of the strongest offensive stretches we've seen from him in camp. He finished with 5 touchdown passes, finding Bowers twice, Naylor twice, and Michael Mayer once. The first thing that jumped out to me wasn't even the 5 touchdowns. It was the distribution. Cousins wasn't repeatedly forcing the ball to one player. He was spreading the football around and making multiple weapons part of the offense. That's exactly what you want from a veteran quarterback running a new system. The red zone is especially important because the field gets compressed. Windows disappear quickly. There isn't much room for a quarterback to wait for a receiver to become completely open. Anticipation matters. Timing matters. Ball placement matters. And the Cousins-Bowers connection is becoming particularly interesting because Bowers doesn't need much introduction. Everyone already knows how talented he is. The question is whether Cousins can consistently get him the football in situations where defenses are specifically trying to take him away. 2 touchdowns in the red zone are a good sign. There was also a reported 3rd touchdown to Bowers that was wiped out by a penalty after he won a contested ball over Quay Walker. So the production might have been even better than the official numbers suggest. But I'm still putting the brakes on the hype, because there's one question I can't ignore. How much of this offensive success is actually the Raiders' offense, and how much is the Raiders' defense making life too easy? That's not a criticism of Cousins. It's simply something we have to consider. The Raiders' defense struggled at times against Arizona, allowing quarterbacks to move the ball with more comfort than you'd want. If the defense isn't generating consistent pressure in practice, receivers are going to find more separation, and quarterbacks are going to look better. That's why Houston is so important. Cousins needs to prove that this rhythm survives against somebody who isn't wearing a Raiders jersey. And while Cousins was putting up numbers, another quarterback quietly gave me something to watch. Fernando Mendoza threw 2 red zone touchdowns of his own. One went to Malik Benson on a slant. The other went to Mike Washington. Again, I'm not going to turn 2 practice touchdowns into a declaration that Mendoza has suddenly solved the quarterback position. That's not how evaluation works. What interests me is the continued connection between Mendoza and Benson. This isn't the first time we've seen them connect. There has been a rhythm developing between them throughout camp, and those little details matter. The timing of the throw, the way Benson comes out of his break, and the confidence Mendoza shows when he releases the ball all suggest that these two are starting to understand each other. That's something I don't want the Raiders to overlook. Jack Beck deserves the attention he received after his preseason performance against Arizona. He earned it. But one strong game shouldn't erase weeks of consistent work from another receiver. That's why Houston could be extremely important for Benson. He needs to prove that this isn't simply a favorable training camp matchup. Against Houston, he'll see defenders who haven't spent 2 weeks practicing against him. The coverage will be less predictable. The physicality will be different. The defensive backs won't already know his favorite releases and tendencies. That's when we find out whether the separation is real. For Mendoza, I'm actually less interested in another touchdown than I am in his decision-making. What happens when his first read isn't open? What happens when the pocket starts collapsing? What happens when the defense disguises pressure? That's the real test for a rookie quarterback. I don't need Mendoza to be perfect. I need him to stay calm. If he takes the easy completion instead of forcing a big play, that's progress. If he recognizes pressure early and gets the ball out, that's progress. If the pocket gets messy and he still makes the correct decision, that's far more valuable to me than another easy touchdown against his own defense. Cousins has a different assignment. He has already shown that he can run the offense efficiently in a controlled environment. Now I want to see if the offense travels. And that leads directly to the most important matchup of this entire trip: the Raiders' offensive line against Houston's pass rush. Danielle Hunter, Will Anderson Jr. Those are the names that can expose an offensive line very quickly. If a tackle's footwork is slightly wrong, Anderson can get around the edge. If communication breaks down, Hunter can find the opening. If the interior line doesn't recognize a stunt, the quarterback can be under pressure before the route even develops. That's why DJ Glaze is going to be one of the players I'm watching most closely. Glaze has shown encouraging traits during camp. His natural length stands out, and he's shown that he can use his hands effectively. But training camp is one thing. Trying to block Anderson in a competitive joint practice is another. If Glaze holds up, I'll take that seriously. It would be one of the strongest indications yet that his development is moving in the right direction. If he struggles, that doesn't mean everything is falling apart. It simply gives the Raiders another piece of information before the games count. That's what this trip is supposed to do, and the defense has its own questions that need answering. Isaiah Pola-Mao gave the Raiders a positive moment by intercepting Cousins. One interception doesn't suddenly change the depth chart, but for a young defensive back fighting for trust, those plays matter. Pola-Mao has been working with the first-team defense alongside Jeremy Chin, so every positive rep carries weight. The Raiders need players who can finish. That was one of the biggest frustrations against Arizona. There were situations where the secondary was close enough to make a play, but when the ball arrived, the defender didn't always locate it. That's the difference between being in coverage and actually finishing the coverage. You can run stride for stride with a receiver and still lose the rep if you don't find the football. That's why I'm encouraged whenever a young defensive back attacks the ball rather than playing scared. Eric Stokes appears to have established himself as the leading option at one corner spot, but the competition opposite him is still wide open. Darian Porter is pushing hard for that opportunity. He reportedly took every first-team rep on Monday, and I don't think that's insignificant. First-team reps are the real currency of training camp. When coaches consistently give a young player those opportunities, they're trying to find out what he looks like against the best competition available inside the roster. Porter's attitude also makes sense to me. The job should go to whoever plays the best. That's how it should be. It shouldn't matter where a player was drafted or how recognizable his name is. If Porter is better, he should play. If Jamal McCoy is better, he should play. If Hezekiah Masses suddenly separates himself, then he deserves the opportunity. The Raiders need this competition. What they can't afford is a cornerback group where nobody separates, and the coaching staff enters September still guessing. Houston can help force that decision. Masses is another player I'm watching closely, because the speed of the opposing offense will reveal whether he's reacting or anticipating. Does he stay attached through the break? Does he locate the football? Does he compete at the catch point? Those details are more important than one interception or one completion. Then there's Kieran Crawford. After being limited earlier in camp, Crawford returned to a fuller workload and immediately recorded a sack of Aiden O'Connell during team drills. That's exactly the type of rep a young pass rusher needs. One sack doesn't guarantee a roster spot. But defensive linemen have to show that their athletic ability can turn into actual disruption. The first step has to become leverage. The speed has to become pressure. The technique has to hold up once offensive linemen start adjusting. Crawford has talked about playing fast and aggressive. Now I want to see whether he can do it consistently. And then, of course, there is Max Crosby. Crosby didn't play against Arizona, but these Houston practices may be more valuable to him than another preseason appearance. Why? Because he needs unfamiliar competition. He needs new offensive tackles, new protection schemes, and different reactions. Crosby has already spent plenty of time attacking his own teammates. Houston gives him a chance to challenge an offense that hasn't been preparing for him every morning. That's where things get interesting. The earlier tension between Crosby and Cousins during camp was memorable. But Cousins is still his teammate. There are obvious limits to how far that competition can go when you're protecting your own quarterback. C.J. Stroud and the Texans' offense are different. Crosby can bring a different level of competitive intensity when the opponent across from him is actually preparing to stop him. That's exactly what I want to see. Not reckless football, not unnecessary fights. Real competition. The kind that exposes technique and forces players to adjust. That's the entire value of these joint practices. They aren't just preseason games without a scoreboard. They're controlled environments designed to create problems that a team cannot easily create for itself. And the Raiders have plenty of problems they need to identify. Cousins needs to experience pressure. Mendoza needs to see disguised coverage. The offensive line needs to communicate against unfamiliar rush packages. Benson needs to beat defensive backs who haven't been practicing against him for 2 weeks. The young corners need to cover receivers they've never faced. And Crosby needs to attack a blocking scheme he hasn't already studied every morning. That's why I care more about how these players respond than how many touchdowns they produce. Take Benson, for example. If he doesn't catch a touchdown in Houston, but repeatedly beats press coverage, creates separation, and earns Mendoza's trust on difficult throws, that's a successful trip. If Mendoza throws 0 touchdowns, but consistently makes good decisions under pressure, I'll be more impressed than I would be by another 5-touchdown practice. If Porter gives up a completion but shows excellent positioning and finishes at the catch point, that's valuable. Football evaluation is about patterns. One highlight can get attention. Repeated execution earns trust. That's also why the offensive line is so important. The Raiders have been rebuilding that group, and now they're about to face a pass rush that can test every weakness. If the line holds up, the confidence surrounding this offense should rise significantly, because Cousins doesn't need a perfect pocket. He needs a functional one. Give him enough time to identify the defense, and his experience can become an enormous advantage. But if the pocket constantly collapses before routes develop, even a veteran quarterback is going to struggle. That's why I'm not looking for a perfect performance. I'm looking for evidence. Evidence that the line communicates. Evidence that Glaze can survive against elite speed. Evidence that Cousins can operate when the pocket isn't clean. Evidence that Mendoza doesn't panic. Evidence that Benson can win against unfamiliar coverage. Evidence that the young secondary can finish. That's what Day 13 couldn't provide. Houston can. And that brings me back to the bigger picture. Right now, I see 2 different versions of the Raiders. One version is the team we've watched in training camp. Cousins looking comfortable. Bowers producing in the red zone. Naylor making plays. Benson building momentum. Mendoza showing flashes. And young players pushing veterans for opportunities. That version is exciting. But there's another version. The Arizona version. A defense that struggled to get off the field. A secondary that sometimes played good coverage but failed to finish. A team that still has unresolved questions across several positions. Both versions can't define this team forever. At some point, the Raiders have to show us which one is real. That's why I'm not dismissing the positive signs from Day 13, but I'm also not getting carried away. 5 touchdown passes from Cousins is encouraging. 2 touchdowns from Mendoza is encouraging. The Bowers connection is encouraging. Benson's chemistry with Mendoza is encouraging. Polamalu's interception matters. Porter's first-team reps matter. Crawford getting home for a sack matters. But those are clues. They're not conclusions. Houston is where some of those clues can become evidence. If Cousins looks just as composed against the Texans as he did against his own defense, I'll feel much better about this offense. If the offensive line can handle Hunter and Anderson, I'll take that as a major step forward. If Mendoza keeps finding Benson when coverage tightens, that chemistry becomes something worth watching throughout the season. If Benson consistently wins his routes against unfamiliar defensive backs, his case for a meaningful role gets stronger. If Porter keeps stacking quality first-team reps, the cornerback competition starts moving toward an answer. If Polamalu continues making plays, the coaching staff has another reason to trust him. And if Crosby starts creating problems for Houston's offense, that could be exactly the kind of defensive spark this team needs. That's what I'm watching for. Not a perfect stat sheet. Not another practice where everything goes according to plan. I want the Raiders uncomfortable. I want them challenged. I want the offensive line forced to communicate under pressure. I want Mendoza forced to make decisions quickly. I want Benson forced to win against defenders who don't know him. I want the secondary forced to find the football. I want the coaching staff to discover the weaknesses that aren't obvious when everyone is wearing the same jersey. Because September is coming. Regular season opponents won't care how good the Raiders looked in red zone drills. They won't care how much chemistry Cousins and Bowers developed in practice. They won't care how exciting Mendoza and Benson look together. They'll attack weaknesses. They'll pressure quarterbacks. They'll disguise coverage. They'll challenge young corners. They'll test the offensive line. And the Raiders need to discover those weaknesses before their opponents do. That's why Day 13 was encouraging. But Houston is the real checkpoint. The Raiders have spent nearly 2 weeks building confidence. Now they have to test it. And honestly, that's exactly what this team needs.